is looking at the history of Nigeria, the history of politics, and so on. We look at it in three spheres, three clusters: the pre-colonial era, the colonial era, then the post-independence, which we'll spend a bit more time on. Starting from the pre-colonial era. Don't forget that before colonialism didn't start until 1861 with the annexation of Lagos, and then it was completed by 1906 with the pacification. Can you imagine it? Say pacify usually means bringing peace, but for the colonialists, it was about smashing, making sure that they have no choice but to accept the dictatorship of the colonial masters. So the pacification of Sokoto in 1906 marked the end of that period of colonizing the entire expanse of Nigeria. So this was then formalized with 1914 amalgamation. So what were the dynamics in the pre-colonial period? That is in the period before 1861. And even before that, you had slavery. Often, a lot of us know about the transatlantic slave trade, and it is a very, very important one in a negative manner, and I will speak to why. But it was not even the first. Before that, you had the trans-Saharan slave trade, in which people were taken not only from Nigeria, across Africa, across the Sahara to Arabia, and even some of those through the Arabia part, even to Europe. Because don't forget that, I mean, way back to there had been interconnections between the Arabs, the Europeans, and so on and so forth. So we won't go into such details to save time, but there was the trans-Saharan slave trade, there was the transatlantic slave trade. For people that might want to go further in terms of historical study on the trans-Saharan slave trade, probably the most authoritative work was by Chancellor Williams. He was a Black American, African American. He spent about 32 to 36 years doing serious research on. In fact, he went more or less blind doing that war. Went through, and he came out with two thick volumes: "The Destruction of Black Civilization" and "The Rebirth of Black Civilization." But anyway, long story short, was that the transatlantic slave trade, and this is why it is in a way much more important. It was on a much massive scale, and it fed into what became capitalism. People, that's why you have the triangular trade. They kidnap people in Africa, altogether about 13 million people, and which were mainly young and vibrant people, took them to the Americas, in North America to plant cotton, in South America to plant sugarcane. Then they got those ones moved to Europe to sell. And so that triangular trade was what made Europe Europe. And that's why, for those also that want to study extra, if you have not read this book, Walter Rodney, it is a must read. How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. It speaks to that period a lot. So, but it was not just about Europe, but also because in Africa itself, in Nigeria, which is there were the communities had different forms of government, and we should not deceive ourselves that everything was just so fine, so rosy, no oppression, no exploitation before the white man came. That will not be true. But there was a qualitative difference in the kind of exploitation, in the kind of oppression, in the kind of way people related. So there were empires, like there was the Benin Empire, there was the Oyo Empire, which also straight to Dahomey today. There was the Borgu Kingdom. There was the Hausa kingdoms even before the Fulani Jihad, and then you had the Caliphate. There was the Kanem Borno Empire, which stretched across current Chad, Niger, and all that. Then there were the city-states. And when you look at it, the places where you had empires were more of places, because there was this historian, I've forgotten this Kenyan historian, who, when we were younger, I did this program, Africa, the Triple Heritage, Ali Mazrui, Professor Ali Mazrui. There's something he used to say. He used to say that geography is the father and history is the mother, or something like that. You see that a lot of how people lived, especially as humankind gradually only learned to be able to master nature, and not always for positive reasons. You see, climate change. We are shaped by the geographical nature of where things were happening. So you see, the empires flourished in places of, savanna and things like that. In the more coastal areas, you had things like city-states. You had the in Warri, in the current Ijaw, and all that sort of. Then you had in the East, what they called acephalos. That's to say they were more of republican. Every family's elder sat together. There was nothing like one king and what have you. So there was all this, but they were different classes. There were, for example, good. One of the things that shows the qualitative difference between even the class exploitation there and later was that in our different societies, you even had slaves having almost as much right as children. There were places in which slaves rose to become heads of the family, heads of the kingdom. Someone like Jaja of Opobo was at a time a slave, you know. There's this joke of well, it's not a joke in Yoruba about the man that gave everything he owned to, and he told his son when he left as a will of that the son can choose only one thing out of the things he owned. Every other thing should go to the slave. And the slave was feeling very happy. But the boy borrowed himself sense and said the only thing he will take is the slave. So everything that belonged to the slave belonged. But what that showed you is that slaves could own things, unlike what happened with the transatlantic slave trade, where the slaves themselves were commodities. So it was different, but that is not to say that things were all rosy. Now, with the transatlantic slave trade sowed seeds of discord. The whites gave guns to communities to kill each other, to this and that, to get slaves. What also shows here, it shows that yes, the white slave traders were the primary drivers of slave trade, but they were also collaborators. Just as today we have collaborators with imperialism. And who are those collaborators? Those collaborators are always part of the ruling class. It was the kings, it was the chiefs that organized raids of other communities to get slaves, while their own children were in their palaces. So now, not to lose thread of things, eventually, and the British can be very, very funny, very hypocritical. They do a lot of film, a lot of, seeming high and mighty about how they stop slave trade. It is not out of their church mind or out of goodness or benevolence. It was because by then, with the kind of wealth that the transatlantic slave trade had been able to make them tap into, they were already now building factories. They were using steam engine. Slavery was drawing them back economically, and they needed to move forward. They needed even the promotion of the kind of clashes that was bringing them slaves before was affecting things that they now needed in the period of industrialization. I mean, you see what is happening in the north now with violent conflict affecting how people go to plant or not. So things like the slave raiding were affecting the production of palm kernels that they needed to buy to go and use for lubricants for machines in the new factories in Britain. It was affecting things like cashew, granite, and all that. So they needed all this to end. That was why they insisted on ending the slave trade, not out of any goodness of their mind. And one thing about capitalism was also this, and it still is so. At the heart of capitalism is competition. Different sections of capitalists are in competition with each other on who will have the lion's share of wealth, of natural resources, of the labor, of the wealth that our labor creates. It has always been so. And now, in the specific case of that period, you had what they call the scramble for Africa. In fact, the only thing that the oppressors and the exploiters are always united about is exploitation of the oppressed. So despite the fact that they were in competition with each other, they were united in how to divide us. And that is how they held the Berlin Conference, where they, divided Africa, that some of them had never been to in their lives. So, and they had to occupy where they claimed. So Britain had to claim what is current Nigeria, and then it started uh, with bombarding Lagos, annexing Lagos, and some of what they did immediately after annexation shows you how what they came was to do was to kill, steal, plunder, and destroy. Within the first few months they laid down in Lagos, they had built prison, but it took them decades before they would build hospital. They started taxing the people and all that. Within the first few years they arrived there, they had started asking people to pay canoe tax, asking people to pay for kiosk, and so on and so forth. But in all this, there was resistance. There was resistance when they started the colonization, and people, even in the late 19th century, fought back. But they had these guns that ratatatatata, when people are coming with bow and arrow and all that, they don't mow people down, the Maxim gun. And some of them even said that, look, we have the Maxim gun. And also, again, to the issue of how oppression is possible only with collaboration of some people on our side. Don't forget that there were just always a few of the whites as officers. They withdraw soldiers from who? From black people. But one of the tricks they did, they would take people from different ethnic groups to be the ones to go and use to pacify other ethnic groups. So when they will start with Lagos, you will be surprised to know that the first police detachment they set up was actually called the Hausa police. They took people that had been taken for slavery from the north and made them to be the police in the west. Now, when they will go and pacify Sokoto, they took some of those that they had already gotten from the west among Yorubas and from Igbo, especially amongst those that say, you people go with the religion of these people, and to those to the north. So the same thing, and you will see that continuity with playing of the ethnic card in a different way by our local ruling class. So anyway, let's fast forward. There's a trend, you see. So, and when they first came with the exploitation, Burna Boy even used this to sing, and we have suffered. They allowed their corporations to own the land first on behalf of the queen, but then they now paid to collect the land. They paid 865,000 pounds to Royal Niger Company that was headed by Tubman Goldie. In fact, you might not know, if not, although none of it is even good, if not for the then girlfriend of Lord Lugard, whom he later married, Flora Shaw. It was Flora Shaw that suggested the name Nigeria, that's Niger area. The name they wanted to name Nigeria before was Goldacia, after Tubman Goldie, who was the head of Royal Niger Company. The same thing that was done in what is now Zimbabwe and Zambia, where they call it Rhodesia, after Cecil Rhodes. Well, you see how these people just see us finish, So they paid 865,000 pounds to Tubman Gold's Royal Niger Company. In today's money, that would be equivalent of 46 million 400 and something thousand pounds. The same way also, when they stopped the slave trade, that they made it seem as if they did out of good intentions, they paid not the people that were enslaved though, but they paid the slave traders for denying them of their property. I can't remember that amount now, but it was in huge money, million. And they did not finish paying them until this century. Until this century. So when people are talking of that, maybe it has been a long time, Oyibo has come, we should face our problem. Tell them it is much more complicated than that. By the beginning of the last century, you started having a working class. And this was because to better exploit us, the colonialists, they set up harbors that they will use to pack those things away. Then they built railway lines to places to the east where they could get coal from Enugu, also get palm kernel. In fact, Oyibo, before they even started all this, they brought their British imperial services to come and check where were the places where there were minerals. They did a lot of survey, study. They also study where are those plants, where can we get, how can we extract as much as we can from these people. So it was this that informed where they laid the railway line and all that. But the thing was, they needed railway workers to people to build the railway and the railway workers to run it. They needed dock workers for and all that. Then they also needed junior people for the native authorities and the civil service. So these were the places around which the first sections of the working class emerged. Trade unions were formed. Even in fact, the first trade union was actually in the informal sector. They were mechanics in the 19th century. But those ones didn't last. But the largest surviving was in the civil service, and then the railway, and then the mines. And they fought for improved wages. They fought against racial discrimination in favor of the whites. They fought. And worker struggle is very important for revolutionaries to have in mind, because we look at when we now come towards how colonialism ended, the central place of worker struggles amongst other things. But here, some other key aspects of the revolutionary struggle of our people was with taxes. They started taxing people, including women, seriously in the 1920s. This led to a series of revolts, mainly by women. It started with the Delta tax riots. People in the Delta province in 1927, they organized communities that had even been fighting each other since the time of the slave trade, that they had pitted them again. They united together to fight. They set up committees, you know. Around Asaba, they even set up, there was this, that was even before the tax system. That was in the late 90s. What they called the movement of the silent ones, where they were attacking the people, the whites trying to take their land. But back to the taxes, you had the Delta taxi revolt, you had in 1929 the Aba women revolt, up till in the 1940s when you had the Abeokuta women's revolt, where they kicked out the king. You might have watched the film of Fumilayo Ransome Kuti on this. Then what are the role of the youths and the journalists and other activists? And then the youths started organizing as the Nigerian youth movements in the 1930s. Then later, the youth became, in fact, youths, that's why when people at times say that you're too young to this thing, tell them to go to places. A lot of those people that became founding fathers of Nigeria, they were in their 30s when they started. You know, Zik founded his newspaper just when he was in his late 30s, but before then he had been writing. All of them. So but they were not the revolutionary youth. You had the Zikist National Vanguard, which was formed in 1946. It was then later banned in 1950. It was the most radical youth movement in the history of colonial Nigeria struggle. But they believed in Zik. They called Zik their inspirer and what have you, but Zik denied them that they were too radical. Now, most of these youths were also journalists. What is the connection? Because we are not just interpreting, we are learning from history. What is the connection of then and now? What is the connection of being youths, being revolutionary, and being journalists? It is not enough just for us to have idea of change. We need to put it out there. And today, as we'll look at when we can get to the next slide, in a way, journalism has been democratized, and that is the place of the social media. So as activists, as youth, we need to know how to use media to also put our voice out there for mobilization, for organizing. And then there were different dynamics in different regions, which reflected the state. We had pointed out how you had different kinds of empires and city-states and all that in different places. All these also shaped the kind of way things unfolded. For example, in the north, where you had strong emirs that with the indirect rule were able to suppress people, it was much more challenging, but that did not stop radicals from emerging. The most prominent was the Northern Elements Progressive Union, which people know, Aminu Kano and all that. But it was not only that. You had the Borno Youth Movement. You had the Zamfara Commoners Party. You had the United Middle Belt Congress. These were militant, radical movements fighting for the rights. So, and then lastly, you will see one important thing here. I will point out, I'll ask when we come to the next slide. Here I talk of anti-racism and nationalism. One of the things about colonialism, that's why when some people say it does not matter, what's the difference between colonialism and I say, it's just like also what's the difference between military rule and civilian rule? I say, if one lived through the two things one is comparing, one would know the difference. I agree that at times even civilian regime can be worse than military in the way Tinubu and even Buhari before him had done. But I was an activist during Babangida, Abacha. I was detained 14 times, and I know that it's not the same thing. There are things now that they will arrest any of us, will go to court, but you couldn't even think of court then. So we are far from where we should be and what we fought for, but it is not the same thing. And that is why no to military dictatorship under. It is not that the civilians are better. Similarly, colonialism entails, there were places in our own lands that blacks, Nigerians could not be. And this caused a number of protests, like there's the Bristol Hotel, this thing. You can Google, because some of the time we won't go into all this. But so racism and anti-racism was also part of what fed into the movements for self-government and nationalism, and then eventually 1960 independence. But before coming to 1960, to wrap up with colonialism, we are often given the impression that it's the founding fathers that fought and won it. But no. The most fundamental thing that marked a departure, that showed Oyinbo that, look, they have to start packing their load, was the 1945 general strike, which started on the 21st of June, 1945, and lasted for 45 days. It's known as the Kola General Strike, cost of living allowance. Workers went on strike across Nigeria, demanding improved cost of living allowance. Because just like what is happening now, inflation had turned people's money to nonsense. Salary no fee buy anything, £1 no balance. And don't forget, this was end of World War II and all that. So there was people in charge. But it was not just workers. They had massive support from the people. In a number of places, like in Enugu, like in Lokoja, landlords gave tenants that were workers on strike rent relief out of solidarity. In places like in Lagos, market women supported the strikers with credits for commodities to buy to cook, and even in some instances, discounts. They were going to picket line to also fit. So there was that synergy of, not this one now that they will say strike today, before midnight is called off and all that. But also this particular strike, and that's important for us for learning of going forward. Even the leaders that time did not want the strike. It's because the rank and file pushed them away. It was a case of, as Fela would say, Bo, lo, ya, pampala. If you don't go, clear roads. And that is part of the challenge for us now of how do we build strong rank and file movements that can say, if they are not ready to leave us, push them away. Even Michael Imodu, the great Michael Imodu, he tried to tamper them down, that may we cool down for. He said, what are you saying? If you people are not leading us, we are going on strike. This is documented even in Imodu's biography. So this was the point of departure. And you had support from a broad area of people. Because of time, we'll sum it up there. But the key thing to point out is it was the working class and youth, because it was also in the wake of that strike that the Zikist National Vanguard came up. A lot of the members of the Zikist National Vanguard were also trade unionists. And, this was what laid the basis for. But when the Oyibo saw that, these ones, they no send, though, Oyibo now started collaborating with the moderate ones. The same kind of thing you had when the military was going. It was the Campaign for Democracy, United Action for Democracy, people like us, Shore, and a mass of other people that made it hell for Babangida and then Abacha. But when they would move over, they collaborated with the moderates, those that were in their ruling class. To save time and put things in context, I break the post-independence period into the 1960s and 70s, the 1980s and 90s, then the 21st century. So it did not take long for the masses to realize that Independence Day, everybody was happy. Oyinbo don't go, everything will be fine, nothing they happen. It did not take long for people to see that, we have entered one chance. First, just like what you're having now, these people, when they came into power, they were more concerned with, although their own is not as terrible as the people in power now, with their own allowances as members of parliament and all that. Okay, what about the poor people? Salary, no increment, no this, that. What did happen? So in less than 1 year, the trade unions are that to write that, look, this cannot continue. We need salary that take home pay that can take us home. There were several protests too by people in the formal economy and all that. But long story short, the first series of strike then took place 1963-64 to demand for adequate pay. And this also had mass support. In fact, in 1964, it moved from demanding the release of the Morgan Commission. After the Shakara strike of 63, there was a commission set up about wages, which was headed by Morgan, a former justice of the Western region. So in 1964, when they didn't release this report, we went on to a much more qualitative strike. It moved from release Morgan Commission because people knew that the Morgan Commission under pressure had been favorable to the work. It moved from that to down with the government. So you can see revolutionary fires there. But it was also not just workers in the early 1960s. The students played key role. But don't forget that in the First Republic, we had just a few tertiary schools. You had University of Ibadan, which had been established in 1948 as a branch of University of London. You had University of Nigeria, Nsukka, which had been built just before independence, but it did not start taking students until November 1960. Then you didn't have universities. You had 1960. It was also then in the early 60s. You had Ahmadu Bello University. You had University of Lagos. The era of universities per se was in the 1970s. So between 1966 and 1982, you had 12, 14 new universities. So this changed the dynamics. That was when you started having stronger students' union. And don't forget, it's the students, universities, and not only, we're also talking of polytechnics and all that. With more tertiary schools also, you had those as Obasanjo described it once, that were teaching what they were not paid to teach. That is to say, radical intelligentsia, lecturers that are activists and things like that. Some of whom, had studied outside the country, and as there became more universities, they were also now grooming more people in the country. So you had students and youth playing role, and some of the key role, right? But even then, when it was just a few universities, they try. 1960-61, it was the students from University of Ibadan that stopped the Nigerian government from signing what was known as the Anglo-Nigerian Defense Pact. And what was the Anglo-Nigerian Defense Pact? It was to sign that even though they had handed independence over to Nigeria, the British will have a military base. That military base, Nigerian government will have no say in whatever happens there. So that military base will be actually part of Britain. British soldiers and, of course, intelligence and all that can enter there without visa or anything. It was the students that said, "Now the craze for heads, but why? Matter why? We don't go agree. March down from Ibadan." So students of UI, then there was the Nigerian Youth Congress, which was a youth body led by people like Dr. Tunji Otegbeye. So there was that. And by the 1970s, when you had larger students, this thing, you had also greater protest. In the 1970s, the first student was killed 1972. I think February 1, 1972. Kule Adepeju, students at the University of Ibadan were protesting against poor feeding. Apampa must go. That was the name of the chief caterer, and was killed. So before coming to the end of the 70s and then moving forward, we look at other forces within our revolutionary history in that 60s, 70s period. It was also, you had the emergence of radical parties. There were before, but to save time, there was the Socialist Workers and Farmers Party, which was formed in April 1963. Unfortunately, there was a breakaway from it to form the Nigerian Labour Party in 1964, but both parties put together, all their membership no reach 5,000, despite the rooted, and that's why they contested in the 1964 elections, and the highest result they got was like maybe 0.003%. I have them in some that I've written extensively on this. Like, for example, if you also check the compulsory, the required material I wrote there, I have figures there. So they didn't, but some of the things that will eternally be to the shame of the revolutionaries in Nigeria was the roles revolutionary left played during the Civil War. Not that they played active role, but the different sides queued behind the ruling class on the two sides. Those on the quote and unquote federal side were supporting Gowon, despite the fact that innocent people were being killed in Biafra. Those on the Biafran side formed the Biafran Communist Party and were supporting Ojukwu, despite the fact that this war, as even Madiebo, who was not a socialist or radical, was the army general on the other side, and he himself was with Ojukwu. But even the General Madiebo said that, look, it is true that, yes, there were pogroms and all that, but the primary fight was between the different sections of the ruling class. And that's why you see, look at it. Who were the people that died? And it was mainly the Igbos that were killed. It was not an equal war. But who were the people that died? Mainly people of working class families, peasant families. On both sides, the ruling class members' families lived well within the context of those times. But it was not all the radicals that queued up behind their different bourgeoisie or capitalists. There were a few, like Pa Curtis was from the then Midwestern state, who shouted that no, we should call for an end to this war. We should not let either side of the ruling class use our head. Workers across all ethnic groups in Nigeria unite. But there were even others that were not as radical as the left that also took this position. Someone like Wole Soyinka, that was why he was detained and wrote that book, The Man Died. So for us as radicals, we must never fall under illusion of hiding behind, of staying behind. And that's why, I said something earlier when I was pointing out anti-racism and nationalism in the earlier this thing, and which is here I now talk of nationalisms. That's ethnic nationalisms and how this results in civil war. So anyway, The 1970s ended with handing over power to the civilian. But what happened? Shagari and Co came, they were living large and putting austerity on the people. It's important. I take this for granted because of time, but when you are looking at any point in history for Nigeria or any country, you also have to have in mind what were the dynamics globally in history at those moments. Like, for example, the slave trade, it was part of the global emergence of capitalism. Colonialism, the defeat of colonialism, yes, things happened in Nigeria and which were central to what happened in Nigeria, but these were also informed by things that were happening outside, which also inspired some of not only what were done, but how things were done. And you see it similarly when we come to the 21st century. It's not accidental that Occupy Nigeria took those kind of slogans at a time that you're having Occupy Wall Street and the Arab Spring. So this is very important. So now in the 1980s, late 70s, early 80s, the capitalist system had started running into serious crisis. They would, the imperialist forces through World Bank and IMF would get countries in Africa and Latin America to adopt the structural adjustment program by the 1980s. But even before the formal adoption of structural adjustment program, in 1981, first in 1980, then there was an amendment to it in 81. The Shehu Shagari regime issued the Economic Stabilization Act, which is what introduced austerity measures. In fact, it was everywhere then. There was this song for those that enjoy juju. You know, my daddy loved Ebenezer Obey and all this. So we grew up hearing that song. Austerity measure, you know, saying that austerity measure touch everybody, but it did not touch everybody the same way or even everybody pata the way that song made us believe. It was that same period that the ruling class was making us face austerity. That do you know that there was a time the chairman of the ruling party, the Nigerian, not National Party of Nigeria, Adisa, what's his name, Akiloye, he celebrated his becoming a billionaire. He threw a party, and this was the time that naira was stronger than dollars. Oh, he celebrated, and that's to celebration. They imported champagne with his picture and name. And this was the time that they were saying no money and it was austerity measure. So, but we did not just take this lying down. There were strikes. There were protests. You had the first major strike for a national minimum wage in 1981. You had protests by students. I mean, there were even some in the 1970s, like the Ali Mongo, which was also by the time the austerity was starting, but it hadn't been officially introduced, right from time of Obasanjo. Anyway, in 80s, 90s, the last defining thing was June 12th, because of time, June 12th, and which has come up a lot in the this Babangida launches book or no. But I think it is also partly diversionary. June 12th was primarily struggle within the ruling class. The main thing, in my view, there's something we're right, which will be in the next edition of our paper coming out next week. The main sin of Babangida is not even June 12, it's the structural adjustment program. That's what they used to destroy the lives of poor working class people while they made money. Because it was all those people, a lot of people that came to push money down, they said he made them through the structural adjustment program thing. The rich got richer and the poor got poorer. So, but it was through struggle that were able to push the military back to the barracks and then got into the 21st century. So for the 21st century, don't forget, at the end of the last century, the Abacha hit everybody, proscribed the labor, proscribed the student movement at some point, and this and that. When the 21st century, we started with Labour Civil Society Alliance, and some of the radical parties that were formed by force in the late 1990s, like Gadifa Emi's National Conscience Party. But they never had a large number, and it is not enough to just have ideas in your head without people, members. Otherwise, it's just nothing. To borrow from Escotoyo is like beautifying the chair. But that is so. But the thing is, whether we have people moving a radical movement or not, when people get pushed to shove, they will fight. But the thing is, without organization, there can't be adequate education and direction for such explosion to lead to triumph for the popular masses. So the relationship between revolution or rebellion on one hand and revolutionary organization and then social progress, these three things, the relationship is like the relationship between heat or steam, a steam engine and movement. I mean, even if you are not physicist, I'm not a science student like Olamide. If you have heat, it can just dissipate. But if that heat enters inside a steam engine, it can result in movement. That is the whole logic even of combustion engine at another level of cars. So people's anger, we are hungry, we are tired, is like that steam. A revolutionary organization, which means an organization with numbers on ground and with perspectives, a clarity of objective, is like the steam engine. And motion is about revolution. So you had Occupy Nigeria, which was largely led by the trade unions. There were no serious revolutionary organizations that could give
Hello?
it direction. Then NSAS, the TIB played a key role in sparking that. Then End Bad Governance, TIB also played a key role there. So long story short is that we have a rich history of revolutionary struggle from centuries back to tap into. Errors were made, but some of those struggles moved us forward to get to even where we are now. And we are now at a critical moment where we should learn from the past, adequately analyze the present, and have clear-cut program and perspectives for the future. And that is the whole essence of this session, to answer that first part, or to put that first part in context of where are we coming from as revolutionaries in Nigeria.